in American Civilization at the University of Iowa. He's authored 3 books on Iowa history. He is on the board of directors for the Wallace House Foundation in Des Moines. He's and this is how I think many of us met him first, was as the Director of History and Community Relations at Living History Farms, and now is the Chief Administrator of the State Historical Society, and was an obvious candidate to be on the Iowa Sesquicentennial Commission. So it's obvious that he has a wealth of knowledge, and we're delighted that he can be part of this celebration and to talk about the interrelationship of schooling and the frontier community in Iowa.
I didn't get all 3 of the parts of chalk dust and something and erasers, but as I figured out, I'm the erasers in that sequence, and I don't know what that means. I was driving up, and it is a beautiful time of year, coming up through north central Iowa, flat land, nice harvest coming in. It reminded me once again, someone, thank heaven, gave us the correlation between Iowa meaning a beautiful land. We don't probably believe that's really what that Indian word means. We don't know who stuck us with that one, but it's a good thing to be associated with. Leland Sage, who taught history here for many, many years, has written a history of Iowa. Leland Sage says the closest that anybody has come is that the word Iowa is probably what the Sioux called the Iowa Indians. It was not what the Iowa called themselves, it was what the Sioux called them, and it probably means dusty noses. My wife has hay fever every August, and she thinks that would probably be a closer term for Iowa. This is also the time of the year that my wife begins making a list of all the men she once dated who now live in warm climates. And I will start to hear that list just any time. But it was a beautiful trip up, and I appreciated it. I got the sunset as it was catching those cornfields, and sometimes the corn pickers were going through with their lights on. I mean, it was nice. It's also a little scary to be handed a topic. This is what you're speaking on tonight, and it's religion and politics in contemporary Russia. And all you can see is that the first word down here is T, like it could be Thomas, but it isn't. So we're going to put that one aside. Let me start out at a rather bizarre place tonight, and if you will hang with me, for just a little while, I will eventually show you how I can tie this back to the topic. But I do want to start in a strange place. I worked at Living History Farms for 14 years. They were 14 very, very good years. And I'm sure many of you have visited Living History Farms, but in order for this next part to make sense, let me give you a little synopsis. Living History Farms has as its mission to tell the story of Midwestern agriculture, and we do that by recreating 4 different time periods and have our interpreters in period clothing go through the daily routines of people in early years. We have a 1700 Iowa Indian site, we have an 1850 pioneer farm, we have an 1875 town, and a 1900 farm. And every day people will go through their routines at the farm sites. They cook a new meal, eat it. It is not a low cholesterol fare for the most part. It is scrumptious, but it is a little on the heavy side. You will see everything you have been told not to eat. You will see bacon, you will see butter, you will see pies cooked with lard, you will see eggs, you will see ham and pork. It is very good, but it reminds me of that reference. It was the old days, back when sunshine, bacon and eggs, fresh air were good for you. But that was a while ago. But people will go through the daily routines of earlier years at those sites. Visitors will walk in, and we don't give tours. People can drop into that site anytime, and the trick to good interpretation is to be able to do the tasks and explain them to the public at the same time. You can't do just one or the other. You have to be able to do both at the same time, and that's hard. Before I went to Living History Farms, I had taught Iowa history and history of women at Iowa State University. I had expected to be a cradle-to-the-grave classroom teacher that classrooms were the only thing I knew, and then the budget cuts of the early 1980s changed that perspective, and I found that I was in a museum situation. But all my background had been in classroom. I had assumed that all history was taught by lectures and readings and writing of papers. And I always assumed that history was written about someplace other than where you are, that important things happen somewhere else. So anything that you know out of your own experience is not to be considered valid historical information. You have to read it in a book in order for it to become legitimate for a history paper. When I went to Living History Farms, I was lucky because I inherited a staff who were not at all hesitant to say, Tom, that is the stupidest idea we have ever heard. They told that to me frequently, and it was good for me to do that because it helped me to expand, and they did it in a semi-supportive way most of the time, so we got along okay. But my first reaction when I thought of visitors coming to the site, my first reaction, because it was the only thing I knew, was to gather those visitors up and lecture to them. We would be standing in this gorgeously recreated historic site, and then I would lecture to them on the history of horse-drawn implements in the latter 19th century. Now there is a real grabber topic when a family has just got off the interstate. This family gets off, this family of four, the first two things they want to know: where are the pot machines and where are the restrooms? And you think if they quit asking for one, they could quit asking for the other. They could cancel themselves out. But no, those were always the two. But suddenly I was faced with a challenge. What is it in my information that's my data bank over here about the history of agriculture? What is relevant to a family of four, or parents and 2.2 children, or whatever is got out of that car, the average family? What is it that we really have that's significant to tell them? And that's a different challenge than I had when I was a classroom teacher, because I didn't have to make my material interesting when I was in the classroom. I could say, you have to know this on the final exam, and that was all the interest level that was necessary. And they would promise me they would learn it up until the final exam, and then neither of us cared if they remembered it past that. That was sort of the common understanding. But here you didn't have the crutch of the final exam, and you had to make your site more interesting than Adventureland or an air-conditioned mall or the zoo or all of those other places they could stop. Your economic welfare depended upon attracting people in. So we had to balance having an educational program and having a content with making it relevant, making it digestible, making it interesting to people who came through. I enjoyed that challenge, but I found that I was in a different mindset. Now stick with me. We are eventually going to get to frontier schools, I promise. One of the things that one of my other early ideas, and this was equally bad, this just was way down there in the bad spectrum, was to think, how are we going to evaluate the interpreters? How are we going to know which interpreters are really filling these people with facts as they come through, and the right facts? So I thought, what if we created just a simple 5-question quiz, and we could change quizzes relating to different sites, and on the way out, maybe we could sneak up on a couple of people and say, we're just doing a test. Could you see if you could remember this from your sites and jot it down? That was a horrible idea. It was just awful. It was below the charts awful. Number one, all of our interpreters would have begun teaching that particular fact, because that's what they're graded on the other end. And that's also the assumption that a fact we know and we can tell them is the most important thing that they're going to get out of that visit. The whole idea that we know something, and if they can learn that particular fact the way we said it, they are going to be better off. I learned two things rather quickly at Living History Farms. One is that an outdoor museum-type setting, in an outdoor setting, there is tremendous stimulation by the sites and the artifacts themselves. People can have one-to-one direct relationship with the site and the things they are seeing. In fact, with no offense to those of you who have been historical interpreters at Living History Farms, and we won't ask you to show your hand, Mike, we found that the most fascinating thing for visitors were the animals. No matter how good the interpreters were, everybody remembered the animals. That's what they really liked. And let me tell you, Mike, if there was a choice of getting rid of you or the oxen, you were dead meat first. I can assure you. Words were not the most important way of learning. They would go onto the sites, and they would look around the sites, and they would have a multitude of impressions and have made associations with things before our interpreters ever said one word. One of the things I began to realize, how Protestant we have become. The 16th century, the Protestant Revolution, the emphasis on the Word as the way of learning. It is the sermon that is the very center of the learning experience. It is not the Mass. It is not the sensuous, is it sensuous or sensory? I know there's a difference between those two, and I get into that sentence and I think I got to look it up next time. It is not the experience of the senses that is what we're talking about. It is the Word. And we have incorporated that in our classroom learning. It is the Word that we teach very early. And I thought, when I looked at that farm site, that 1850 farm site, that has a lantern, that has an old quilt, that has a bed that only has one leg, the other two are, two of the sides are attached to a wall, so it only needs one. You look at the chinking in those logs. All of the things that people come in and say, wow, this is neat, and they look around, and I thought, in most of the classrooms that I grew up, for example, they are as deliberately as boring as possible, so that there will be no distraction from the Word that is coming from the teacher. No teacher stands in front of open windows and lectures, because the chances are that there's something more exciting going on behind him or her is real good for a lot of times. I wouldn't have done that. But I realized my classroom experience was tightly structured, and the teachers were telling me what they wanted me to learn, and they were not sending me off to evaluate very often. We didn't have many classes where they were sending me off and said, now you think about this, and we're not going to tell you what the final answers are. What I came to understand about the best way to evaluate the visitor experience at Living History Farms was when they walked out through the ticket booth and they were saying, you know, I had never thought about it before, but. And what followed their but out of the ticket booth, that was fine. If they hadn't thought about it before, and we have now made them think about it, it's not the content of what they're thinking about, it's the fact that we have given them something that has caused them to see the world in a new way. We don't get the right to shape what that new way is. That's where we give up the control, and sometimes that's hard. We didn't have a message that we were trying to say. We weren't trying to say that everything since 1700 has been progress, or that we're going to hell in a handbasket ever since 1850, or ever since women got the right to vote. I'm not the one who made that point. But the leaving that open-ended to what the visitor wants to say, that's what good interpretation is. And that was hard to give up that control. And the second thing is like unto the first. When I went back and I looked at what I had been teaching in my Iowa history courses, it hit me just right in the middle of the forehead. I was teaching those things that were testable. If it wasn't testable, if it somehow expanded their world into wonder or imagination, how are you going to grade that, particularly in a multiple choice test? Otherwise, you're going to have to grade essays at the end, and you're going to just get the student that writes best, and how are you going to grade content? But as a teacher, I look back and I said, I taught what was testable, and I limited the universe of what was possible down to what was testable. And it occurred to me what I was really trying to do as a teacher was to impart knowledge. Now, there's nothing the matter with knowledge, but how rarely I ever aimed at wisdom. how rarely any of my teachers really, I think their mission was to make me wise. They were going to make me smart, but wise, I think we're a little uncomfortable with that word. I don't know that wisdom has been mentioned in the current presidential campaign. In fact, we may have to go back several presidential campaigns before we get someone who claims, I am going to bring wisdom to this office. The political buzzword for the past 4 years has been wonk. If you are a policy wonk, wonk is know spelled backwards, K-N-O-W, and it means you know all the data that there is about this particular subject. You have a command of the data, but does it really say you're very wise in that whole thing? Where in our society do we hunt for or do we find wisdom? And, see, I told you, eventually I would get back to the community, the frontier school, and this is the part that we're now going to try that as a background. It may absolutely fall apart, but I think we can bring it off. We had a school program at Living History Farms. It was a very successful program. We ran it mostly with volunteers, but we would bring in school classes of 25, 30 students, and they would spend a 2.5 to 3 hour session going through a curriculum in our school. They dressed in historical clothing, which usually meant the girls wore a kerchief around their head, and the boys wore blue jeans with a red bandana in their pocket, and they were supposed to bring their lunch with only things that they would have had in 1875. We appropriated Twinkies, we appropriated Oreos. We usually gave them back, but we pointed out they couldn't have them. You couldn't have aluminum foil. You couldn't have plastic. You were trying to figure out how to get your lunches packed with 1875 stuff. The school marms for this program were trained. They were given a site manual, and a site manual has different subjects that they can teach. They have penmanship, it has spelling, it has geography. There are arithmetic questions that they can ask to the students, and the students will do them on their slates. There are suggestions for readings out of our McGuffey readers and what to do with a readings class. We have an elocution session. We learn how to hold a book properly by putting your fingers along the spine, standing with your right foot forward, holding up your book, and projecting to the back of the room. Reading out loud, I don't know if it is better or worse than it was, but it can be painful to hear some of the reading that was going on. But we don't have a prescribed curriculum that all teachers have to go through. We give them the materials and we tell them, will you set up your own curriculum through the day and figure out how to come out right at the end of 2.5 hours. I found I always wanted to end with spelling, because you can have your kids lined up, and if it gets to the end of the hour, then you ask shepherd. Shepherd was usually pretty good to put them down. Lattice, that just sent everybody down, but you could just about time it when you were going to ask those particular words to get them to sit down. But what was the historically correct curriculum for a one-room school? Well, they were pretty vernacular. They came from the ground up. They varied greatly with the teacher. The content might be something similar, but how the teacher used the material, that was pretty much her own. But one day I was listening to a wonderful volunteer teacher we had who was training the school marms. And I listened to her training session, and just time and again, the light went on for me. It was more than just the information she was saying, but she was telling the school marms that our job in training these children is to create perfect people. That's what teachers in 1875 were about. They were training perfect people. So when you have them do their penmanship, have them write perfectly. And when they turn in their arithmetic papers, make sure that they understand that their job is to turn in a perfect paper and a perfect geography lesson. And if it's a memory assignment, that they will memorize that perfectly. And if you're going to talk about music and art, that they should discover the highest love of music and art that is possible. And I remember sitting there as the light came on, and it dawned on me 150 years ago, 125 years ago, 1875, we had at least a notion of what a perfect person would be. And that's a difference, that we had the ideal that was out there for which we were shooting. Stephen Covey, in his 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, says one of them, start with the end in mind. And when I sat there listening to Sharon Townsend inform the Barnes about creating perfect people, I said, what is our idea today that we could agree on as the community educating our children of what perfect people are? We have debates all the time, and it's no wonder the teachers really don't have very clear guidelines on what the community says creates perfect people. And why is this difference? Why is it different between 1875 and today? One of the things I think is when we look back at Iowa in the latter part of the 19th century, the country school was by no means the melting pot. We talk about the American schools as being melting pots. Well, don't believe it in a rural area. Iowa was settled with ethnic pockets all around the state. There were German neighborhoods, there were Dutch neighborhoods, there were Yankee neighborhoods, there were sort of mongrel American neighborhoods, but they were distinctive in that on its own. But it was not until World War I, with the advent of automobiles, with the amalgamation of popular culture and radios and movies and so forth, that we all began to see a homogeneous version of what America might look like. But until World War I, we had foreign language press in Iowa. There were many communities where the street language was something other than English. The church was often the center of the community, and that community began with a set of shared values. The schools were to reflect those values. And when you think about a school district or a sub-district within a township with its 4 square miles, that 4 square miles probably being all of the same ethnic background and very likely attending the same church and having all sorts of community ties, that is not a melting pot situation. What is going to be taught in the schools are very clearly the values that are surrounding that the parents have surrounding that. Teachers were drawn for the community, and they knew what those values were. The teachers often had to embody those values permanently. This idea that you are protected in your teaching assignment from the wrath of the community if you violate those values, hooey on that in 19th century. I know a woman as late as the 1930s who was asked to put out her hand during a teaching interview so that the principal could check and see if she had nicotine stains. Smoking was forbidden for that. Very frequently, the teacher was expected to teach Sunday school, and those who worked with youth were the exemplary ones in the community, and they were held to different standards. One of the things that happened during the 19th century that strengthened this was that the teaching profession became predominantly female. Now in Iowa, until the Civil War, males occupied more than half of the occupied more than half of the teaching spots. Females were less than half. But it was 1862 and 1863, as more and more males were called to the war, that women became a majority. And then in the 1870s and 1880s, there was a big growth in the state. They were desperate for teachers. And what we saw was that women did not have other professional options and went into the teaching profession in much sharper percentages. One of the questions, though, that rarely gets asked in that context, we know that women were going into the profession. Why were men not applying to become teachers? We can see the rise in women applicants. Why was there an absolute drop in the number of males? In part, you and I the state began to impose teacher standards. You had to take a summer workshop. You had to take some courses in order to become a teacher. Well, for men, teaching primarily had been this job they could drop in and out of until they got something that paid better. Women were sort of stuck in there because they didn't have options. But if you're going to require men to take professional training to get a job that they're not going to stay in very long, it's like requiring a summer or two of lifeguard training for high school kids. Hooey on that. I'm not going to be a lifeguard beyond high school, so I'm not going to spend any investment in training. So we saw men withdraw. And with women in the 19th century, this aura of women as carrier of moral values also began to be imposed, and the schools became one of the places that American society was going to train its children. I think that's important because as women became seen as the carriers of values, we see the schools becoming more and more this place where, yes, you can expect them to produce perfect people, or at least as close as they can come in a teaching situation, and the emphasis on that moral development in youth. But I was struck by Sharon Townsend's instruction that we are going to teach perfect people, that we are going to create perfect people in our schools, and that is what there was an agreement on that with what perfect schools would be. I have come to discover that sometimes what carries a historical message rather than facts is context. And I would like to share this evening one of my absolute favorite stories about a one-room school. I don't know how many of you have read Curtis Harnack, We Have All Gone Away. It's a story of growing up in far northwest Iowa, and it's in the early 20th century. You will hear cars in this story, but I think when you listen to that, you are going to get the sense of the community values. You're going to get the sense from the inside out of what it meant to live live in a rural community and to attend a one-room school. And I thought about this probably contains more of that inside-outness than I could give you in a straight lecture. I'm going to read the chapter that he writes entitled Queen of Hearts, and where he is talking about one of the teachers that he had in his one-room school. The new teacher, Miss Flock, was hired just 1 week before country school opened. Through Mother's last-minute influence, 2 neighbor children, Dwayne and Orban, who were attending the Catholic parochial school, enrolled instead in the rural schoolhouse, thus keeping it open 1 more year. My cousin Lois and I were the last of our family still in the lower grades, and everyone thought it best if we could continue at the one-room schoolhouse 3/4 of a mile away rather than attend public school in town. As the year developed, I don't know how far we could have gotten along without Orban, a first-year scholar, for we taught him to play pinochle. And counting Miss Flock, we totaled 8, the right number exactly for a double round. Because each year was expected to be the last, the schoolhouse had slipped into disrepair, and we listed to one side on its foundation of cracking limestone. The building was about the size of our corn crib, large and peeling white, with sparrows' nests straggling from the eaves. A row of wind-stunted box elder and ash trees rimmed the schoolyard, and the plot was moored to the gravel road by a homemade roadway. When a high gale blew off the flat cornfields, the loose shingles fluttered and snapped like a flag we ceremoniously raised aloft each morning and revered with religious awe. I mention the flag because Miss Krakow, our former teacher, instilled in our imaginations an enormous respect for it. The command never to let the flag touch the ground came to imply that if it did, the cloth would snarlingly wrap around us, and if it were raised upside down, even halfway, through gross carelessness, doom would descend. In the schoolhouse, the flag lay on a shelf in front, flanked by pictures of George Washington and Abraham Lincoln, relics for contemplation. We were patriotic, every one of us. We pledged allegiance each morning in case anyone had had a change of heart overnight. Our hands were over our hearts, and it had to be the correct heart on the left side, or she rapped our knuckles with the ruler. But after many years of teaching, when all of us were certain of her performance, Miss Krakow got married and left us to shift for our patriotic selves, an almost traitorous act, except that surely she didn't imagine that Miss Flock, when she arrived, would scarcely pay a bit of attention to the red, white, and blue. But then no one could have anticipated Miss Flock, even the wisest. On the first day, her Hupmobile bounced across the ditch over the sunken fill-in and onto the schoolyard just a few minutes before 9 o'clock. All 7 of us were assembled on the bare, open platform in front of the school door. On this little shelf, Miss Krakow had held her miniature military drill, and by this time we would have been all set to watch the flag go up. Now I sat peeling splinters off the porch and sticking them quietly into Delbert, who stupidly complained aloud of wasps. Little Orban, overall to within an inch of his chin, looked furtively at us and at the locked door to knowledge, while the meadowlarks in the fields sang unending praise. We silently watched the Hupmobile swish through the bluegrass and come to a gasping halt under the shadiest tree. Miss Flock smiled, climbed out, and slammed the door with verve. "What are you doing here so early? School starts at 9, and that's about when I'll get here." We all wanted to inform her that Miss Krakow had always arrived an hour early, but none of us said a word. When she marched onto the platform, we scattered from her path. "I've got a long ways to come." She took keys from a purse, glittery in the sunshine. "Farther than you have." She looked directly at Orban. He was too frightened to speak. "What's the matter? Can't any of you talk? I learned when I was 2, and I've been at it ever since." She got the door open and with the help of a firm kick and walked inside. Desks had been polished, the floor swept with red oily compound, and the curtains laundered. All this had been accomplished by the wives of the school directors. Uncle Jack was on the board. "You there," Miss Flock said as she nabbed Dwayne, who towered a foot above her. "What's your name?" He told her with a lazy smile because he figured he'd have some fun with this one. "How old are you?" "Pretty near 16. "Well, let me know when you are. You're too big to be in school. Don't your dad need you on the farm?" "He could use me all right," said Dwayne, "but I don't need him." We all laughed. Miss Flock said, "Since you're the oldest boy in school, you're going to do the work. Get the bucket of drinking water from the trunk of my car, and after you've brought it in, scrub the sink and washstand. When it gets cold in fall, I'll have you hauling coal every day. You'll learn something yet in this school." Miss Flock marched to the front and stood in the morning sunlight. Her dark hair was pulled tightly back off her face and fell without much pretense of curl but behind her ears. I thought she was beautiful, at least compared to the last one. Her features were regular and plenty of them. She would be a good subject for observation in the hundreds of hours that lay ahead, and every little piece of her could be noticed and dissected. "Take your seat," she announced. Since we had no assigned seats, this was perplexing, but we stirred ourselves to crawl in somewhere and tested the desks for size. We pulled out the resistant drawers, wiggled, rocked, and fingered the hard, squashed gum on the undersides of the desktops. After considering whether neighbors seemed satisfactory, we made our choices. "Through?" she finally asked, not having paid us the least attention. "All right now, I'm going to read some literature to you before we do anything else. You better shut up and listen because I could just as easy not read." She picked up the book. "This is The Bobbsey Twins in South Dakota, Chapter 1. On that first morning in the wonderful wheat country, the twins woke up and asked, 'Where are we?'" She read on, passing chapters 5 and 6. At the end of each section, she paused, teasing us until we applauded to show our interest. Things really became exciting, and I hardly heard my stomach growling, a sure sign it was 11 o'clock. "Now this is absolutely the last," she said, launching into the 11th chapter. I knew it was hard for her to put the book away, for she'd become highly interested in the story, but she read in such a fast sing-song we couldn't understand her anymore. Finally, with an exhausted slam of the book, she declared recess and moved quickly for a dipper of water. We played softball until we got so hungry we had to fetch our lunch pails. Miss Flock seemed to take our general declaration of noon hour in stride. We sat on the platform before the front door and dangled our legs over the edge while we munched dry sandwiches and gurgled milk from our vacuum bottles. Miss Flock had a strange lunch, not in the least balanced. She ate 5 huge dill pickles right in a row, then a deviled egg and a piece of cream pie that was gooey and difficult to manage. After wiping cream fluff from her nose, she asked if anyone would care to finish her coffee. We all spoke, eager to see if it would stunt our growth. Miss Flock smiled and passed her cup around. A rich feeling of excitement and freedom crept over me. I had to share it with Delbert. "She ain't no teacher," I whispered to him. "She's a kid like us." "I ain't afraid of her," Delbert said, swaggering, missing my point. I crawled over to Norma. "What do you think of her?" "She sure ain't like the other one." "She ain't a teacher," I whispered. "There's been some mistake, but let's not tell anybody." Norma gave me the look of an accomplice. "Let's play ball again after lunch." But Miss Flock would have none of it. She marched us inside, wound the Victrola, and we started the music lesson with Old Dog Tray, followed by Decamptown Races. Miss Flock joined in, a mezzo-soprano experimenting a bit with harmony, especially when Big Dwayne growled along in the deep bass. At the end of a song, she burst out laughing and sometimes even clapped. We clapped too, having more fun with the singing business than ever before. "Let's see what all you've got here," she murmured, and went through the whole collection, record by record. I didn't know when I'd sung so much, and Miss Flock, challenged by the vocalist, couldn't seem to stop. I began to feel a little uneasy lest some parents stop by and wonder if the Songfest should take the place of arithmetic and spelling. But of course no parent would visit unless invited, and none of us were driven to school by car, so there was no chance of a parental glimpse into our life there. We walked from our farms, even in winter when snowbanks closed the roads. We traveled in a group, gathering neighbors along the way. Miss Flock was in no danger of being checked on unless one of the pupils talked. Delbert, a stickler for regularity, became increasingly nervous about the neglected flag, which still lay folded neatly on its shelf of honor. At last, when a record ended, he marched to the shelf and took up the precious cloth. "Come on, Dwayne, you and me's going to put this up before it's time soon to take it down." Miss Flock watched them with lifted eyebrow. "Where are they going?" she asked me. "The flag's supposed to go up in the morning, first thing." "Well, after this, they'd better not forget it." Then she slammed shut the Victrola and immediately assigned us lessons. We drew out our books reluctantly, feeling that Delbert's allegiance to rules had spoiled a good thing. In the middle of the afternoon, Miss Flock declared recess and organized another softball game. 4 against 4. She pitched in the balls to Dwayne so hard he complained his hands stung. We could scarcely see the ball, let alone bat it. But whenever we did score a hit, she always caught the ball and fired it into first, no matter who was the first baseman. I could tell from the way she played that her aim was not just to be a good sport. She loved softball as much as anybody, and we had somehow to live up to her expectations. Otherwise, tomorrow might be different, with endless hours of spelling and geography and arithmetic. Although there was no organized conspiracy of silence, each of us guarded the day's events when we went home that night, and not a word leaked. It wasn't until later in the year that Miss Flock described the county school superintendent's car and suggested we sound the alarm if it were sighted. As the weather turned colder, we stayed indoors more of the time. Someone was assigned to keep an eye on the road, usually the pupil facing the window across the pinochle table. Miss Flock was surprised that most of us couldn't play pinochle, for it had been taught to her by the time she was 5, and she looked at little Orban. "No, he ain't too young. He can hold his cards in both hands, and I'll play them, just so as we'd have enough people playing to make the melds big." Miss Flock loved to use 2 pinochle decks, for then the chances of a double marriage, a double pinochle, and a royal straight were infinitely increased. We were dealt quite a mittful, but she said our fingers would get stronger, and that would be good for us. We let her play Orban's hand until we saw how she could work it to her advantage, and then we insisted everyone should take turns. His hand wasn't useful unless you could make him throw away heavy-paying cards on tricks you were about to take. This is what Miss Flock did all the time, and I doubt we would have noticed it if little Orban himself hadn't caught on to the game and said suddenly, his eyes watchful and angry, "No, this card, this one, not the 10 spot." We were astonished. I looked, and sure enough, Miss Flock had been loading up her tricks until poor Orban had very little left in his hand. "Don't you have card parties at home?" Miss Flock asked quickly to divert attention. "No," said Lois, who quickly shared Orban's distress, "and little kids wouldn't be allowed to play anyhow." "Oh, really? I can tell you I learned plenty fast. I'd have got a licking if I didn't," she added darkly, and Orban squirmed. This puzzling reference to her personal life was another bit to add to what we already knew. She mentioned attending the local high school for 2 years for her teaching certificate. Ours was her first school. But we wondered if she had any dates or attended dances, and if so, what she wore, for she stuck with tiresome regularity to a shapeless purple dress. Since neighborhood card parties were the only social life she mentioned, I thought a clan of card parties met almost every night. At home, I guardedly asked why we didn't belong to such a group, and their objection was that Catholics and Protestants were all mixed up at card parties. With kids along associating with one another, likely as not the Catholics would grab off a few Protestants through marriage, and that would be the upshot of all the card playing. I figured Miss Flock didn't have the Catholic problem we did. In late October, Dwayne turned 16, and though he could have legally quit school, Miss Flock persuaded him to stay because she wanted him to play father in the Christmas pageant. Our school Christmas programs in the past had not been elaborate, but clearly Miss Flock had other ideas. Pinochle sessions were cut short in November, and soon after lunch we dragged the teacher's desk behind the stove, shoved the recitation bench along the opposite wall, and walk on stage. Orban, Lois, and I pretended to be children, and Norma played the mother with a vengeance rivaled only by Norma's mother. Miss Flock made up the lines as we went along, and we were supposed to remember them. Occasionally we studied. In a burst of sudden academic enthusiasm, Miss Flock sent us to our books. As though it were all a game, we'd rush through recitations, have spelling bees, and hop up and down from our seats to try our minds at learning. But play rehearsals dominated the days, and after a few weeks of constant practice, we knew our speeches perfectly. Then Miss Flock worried lest we forget the play before Christmas arrived. To sustain our interest, we embarked upon an ambitious project of making hand-decorated invitations for all parents and members of the school board. Each adorned card was to be as different in as many colors as possible, with extensive use of gold and silver dust, which Miss Flock valued so highly that she kept the vials in her purse at all times. Once the invitations were completed, she suggested we make Christmas presents for our parents. After several abortive attempts at fancy hot pads, bookends, and lampshades, we settled down to vary a basic idea supplied by Miss Flock. We painted doorstops. The raw material was a good-sized stone. Although some of us came from the same family, Miss Flock maintained that 2 stones or even 3 could be useful around the house for keeping doors open or possibly forcing them shut. Now, in this section of Iowa, stones were about as rare as cactuses, and when a farmer turned one up, neighbors crossed the field to look it over. The only place we knew there were stones was under our schoolhouse, the foundation, so we hauled away the likely-looking chunks. "Not near the corners," warned Miss Flock. "Don't mess around with those stones. We need something to hold this building up." When processing the stones, Miss Flock was in doubt about what to try first. We used up all the drinking water in washing the rocks, then placed them in the sun to dry on the front platform. Several of us varnished them. Dwayne insisted on painting designs, which ran together until he had a mess that looked like something a huge bird had emitted during mulberry season. Norma and Delbert were probably on the right track, for they clipped out pieces of colored construction paper and slapped them in patterns onto their rocks, hoping to make a decal which could be covered with varnish. But they ran into chemical difficulties, having applied the varnish when the stones were still wet. The result, when it dried, was a monstrous, ragged oddity that defied explanation, even though there were 2 of them. Miss Flock thought they were wonderfully funny, and when we all got through laughing, Norma confessed that her stone wouldn't even do for knocking mud from your overshoes. Finally, with a joyous shout, we gave up, piled all our stones together in a cairn on the workbench, and sat down for a good game of pinochle. In the weeks preceding the Christmas pageant, we played cards every chance we could to relax us, said Miss Flock. We decorated the schoolroom with fringed crepe paper streamers and pinned cutouts of stars and Christmas trees to the window curtains. On the day of the performance, the last afternoon before vacation, Miss Flock brought homemade cookies and pots of coffee. The audience arrived well ahead of time, and from behind the bedsheets strung across the stage, we watched them squeezing into our desks like ridiculous, overgrown children. Then our pageant began, and never had we given such a performance. And in an emotional scene, Norma wept so copiously she alarmed the cast, and several mothers seemed about to rush forward. As the curtains closed, the applause was tremendous. Presents were passed around, and Miss Flock collected a handsome pile, gifts from each of us and from all the parents. It was clearly her day. Everyone in the audience felt moved to tell her how talented she was with children, and in how all the years of country school there'd never been a Christmas program as good as this one. Having the right teacher the first years, I heard Mother say, is so important. She taught country school herself before marriage. She looked dotingly at Miss Flock. I thought how upset she and everyone would be if they knew the truth. Why didn't you tell us, they'd asked. But I could never explain our conspiracy. I just knew I'd never betray Miss Flock, and I was sure none of us would. However, on the way home, Orban, who was riding with us, blurted out, "Why are the 8s no good when you play pinochle?" Dwayne jabbed him in the ribs. "Because that's the game, stupid." A pheasant whirred out of the snowy ditch in burnished glory, and Mother and Aunt Lizzie cried, "Oh, look at him." "Well, I'm tired of pinochle," said Orban. "Nobody's ever saying you'll have to play it," his mother replied. "That's what you think," Orban tried to say more, but Dwayne throttled him, and just then we drove into the farmyard and let them out. In the farewells, Dwayne's mother said, "You know, I said to Dwayne, you're 16 now and you don't have to go to school no more. But you know what he says to me? Mom, I want to keep it up." "A good teacher makes all the difference," said Mother. Thank you. Is there a format now?
I'm curious, when we were doing research for the exhibit at the museum, they were talking about how much teachers were paid, or more likely not paid in many ways. And one of the statistics we found, at a certain point in the late 1800s, a hired hand made a great deal more than a female school teacher. Why, if they were such paragons of virtue and had to maintain the status in the community, were they so badly paid?
A couple of things you ought to factor into that. Were the statistics by the month or the year?
Probably by the month.
Okay, well, sometimes the school teachers were provided room and board, and that was factored in. Also, I think John Kenneth Galbraith has come up with the best explanation. Women were assumed to have what he calls the convenient social virtue, and that is that, of course, women were not working primarily to make money like men were. Women were working in order to provide a public service. Therefore, nurses and teachers and anything that women went into was presumed to be, they were there not for pecuniary reasons, but it also was what the market would hold, and it was assumed that women were working until they got married, and it was something that they were filling in. But it's demand for labor. Men had other options, and when they saw teaching versus being a hired hand, they had other options to could go into. I think there's been an impact certainly on the entry into teaching in the past 30 years with opening of other professions to women, medicine, law, business, and so forth, that they were once restricted to, and we are fighting to get good teachers where once there was a pool because of the restrictions on the outside. I think it's primarily economic. Men had other options to go into, and women needed teaching jobs. That would be my guess. But there could be some different factors that are playing into that. Yeah.
I'm intrigued with your concept of the word being so specific. And wouldn't you say that that was almost exemplified by McGuffey's readers in a sense, or not?
Yes. Yeah. I think there was an emphasis on the word. My point was that in classroom learning, we have emphasized the word at the sensory experience. Yes, but on that point, McGuffey's Readers was a very didactic reader. You not only learn to read, but you absorb moral instruction right along at the same way. Your reading assignment was also helping you to become a perfect person.
But he identified your perfectness by giving you the way to pronounce the word, by introducing the word, and by using it that way, so that he attempted to give you the perfect background, in a sense, that you might suggest.
Yeah, I would see McGuffey as a good emphasis on the word. And once again, there was a common understanding on where we wanted to take children. The emphasis was not on developing necessarily creative minds. We wanted to take them in the direction that we knew. And I think we've lost that sense of commonality of purpose in what a perfect child looks like. Other questions? I know writing wears you out.